Judge recognizes her childhood love during a trial, and what happens next leaves everyone in shock. Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment below where you're watching from. Now, let's dive into another emotional story that will surely touch your heart. Rebecca Taylor was the kind of person who could silence any room the moment she walked in. Dressed in her immaculate robe, she strode to the bench with the confidence of someone who had achieved the impossible. Her upright posture, steady gaze, and unshakable tone of voice made her one of the most respected judges in the country. No case slipped through her grasp, and her reputation as a fair, ethical, and utterly committed advocate of the truth was beyond question. That morning was no different. The courtroom was packed, as it often was when Rebecca presided over high-profile cases. Journalists filled the gallery, eager to capture every detail of yet another historic decision. She, however, seemed oblivious to it all. Her focus was on the documents before her, her mind as sharp as a blade, already piecing together the puzzle of the new legal challenge ahead. Yet, beneath all this strength, there was something few could see. Rebecca Taylor was a woman who had it all: success, respect, and an indisputable legacy. However, something lingered in the shadows, even during her greatest moments. A sense of emptiness. It wasn't a recent feeling. It was rooted in a past Rebecca worked hard to keep hidden. In rare moments of silence, far from the cameras and crowds, she often found herself reflecting on what could have been. Rebecca was born in Ashland, a small town surrounded by rolling green hills and a river that cut through the center like a silver ribbon. Her childhood was simple but happy. Her mother was a teacher, and her father, a dedicated mechanic. They did everything they could to ensure Rebecca had opportunities they had never had themselves. From an early age, she displayed sharp intelligence and uncommon determination. It was in this town that Rebecca met Michael Carter, the boy who would change her life forever. Michael was her neighbor and best friend. With warm brown eyes and a smile that seemed to brighten even the cloudiest days, he captured Rebecca's heart in a way she never expected. Their friendship blossomed into something more as they grew up. At 15, they shared their first kiss by the river on a summer afternoon. Rebecca and Michael were inseparable. He had a free spirit and dreamed of starting his own business, while she already knew she wanted to study law and change the world. They were opposites in a way that balanced each other perfectly. In Michael's arms, Rebecca felt she could face anything. But fate began to intervene during their final year of high school. Rebecca received a full scholarship to one of the most prestigious universities in the country. It was her chance to make her dreams come true, but it meant leaving Michael behind. He couldn't follow her. His family depended on him to help run their small hardware store. Rebecca suggested they keep in touch and try a long-distance relationship. Michael agreed, but something in his eyes told her he knew how difficult it would be. Their first year apart was full of passionate letters and long phone calls. Michael supported Rebecca from afar, and she threw herself into her studies, determined to honor the sacrifice they were both making. But as the months went by, the messages became less frequent. Michael seemed distant, and Rebecca, overwhelmed by her studies, didn't have the time to push. Then, one day, he disappeared completely. Rebecca tried to reach him in every way possible but received no response. The pain of losing him was overwhelming, not just because she had lost the man she loved, but because there were no answers. Not knowing what had happened, Rebecca buried her emotions and decided to focus entirely on her career. She vowed never to let anything distract her from her goals again. Back in the present, Rebecca was reviewing the papers for an important case. Her eyes scanned the lines, absorbing every detail, but her mind occasionally wandered. Sometimes it was inevitable. The memory of Michael still haunted her, even though she would never admit it to anyone. Life in the courtroom was relentless, and Rebecca had learned to lock her emotions away. It was a rule she followed religiously: never show weakness. Even so, the lonely nights in her modern, impeccably decorated yet empty home served as a constant reminder that something was missing. Rebecca had friends and colleagues who admired her, but no one who truly knew what she carried inside. Professional success, while gratifying, wasn't enough to fill the void Michael had left. That afternoon, as she organized the case files on her desk, Rebecca came across a name that made her heart skip a beat. It was something she never expected to encounter. Among the papers was a case involving Michael Carter. She leaned back in her chair, her eyes fixed on the name. It could have been a coincidence, but something inside her told her it wasn't. With trembling hands, she picked up the document and began reading. The words seemed blurred, as though her mind refused to accept what was right in front of her. The man she had loved, the one who had vanished from her life without explanation, was back. And somehow, he was involved in a case that had landed under her jurisdiction. Rebecca felt a whirlwind of emotions but didn't let anything show. She decided to handle the situation as she always did, with professionalism and control. Deep down, though, she knew her past was about to come knocking, and the carefully constructed facade of strength and authority she had built over the years was beginning to crack. What would this case reveal? And more importantly, was Rebecca ready to face the man who had broken her heart so many years ago? The judge, so accustomed to being the unshakable force in the courtroom, didn't realize that this time, it would be fate passing judgment on her past. Rebecca Taylor was used to handling the unexpected. However, as she reviewed the case files for the trial that morning, she felt a faint unease. It wasn't obvious, just a subtle discomfort that had lingered since she first read the defendant's name, Michael Carter. The case involved armed robbery at a convenience store, and Michael was accused of being an accomplice. According to the reports, he was a mechanic, a widower, and the father of 2 young children. He worked hard to provide for his family, and nothing in his record suggested any involvement in criminal activity. Yet the prosecution claimed there was evidence placing him at the scene of the crime. At first, Rebecca treated it like any other case. Even so, something about the name and the circumstances stirred an unexpected restlessness in her, a feeling she couldn't quite identify. The hearing began as usual, with the court officer announcing the case. Case number 3856, the State versus Michael Carter. Rebecca looked up from her papers to observe the defendant. Michael was being escorted to the defendant's bench, handcuffed. He wore a simple, visibly worn shirt and carried himself humbly, yet there was a determined look in his eyes. When he lifted his head, his eyes met Rebecca's. In that instant, Rebecca felt an inexplicable connection. Something in Michael's eyes made her hesitate for a brief moment. There was a mix of vulnerability and strength in his gaze, as though the weight of his circumstances had shaped someone resilient yet profoundly weary. It was a look she couldn't ignore. Rebecca pushed the feeling aside and adjusted her posture. She was a judge, and the courtroom demanded impartiality above all else. Any emotional connection was a risk she couldn't afford to take. "Prosecution, you may present the charges," she said, regaining her firm and professional tone. The prosecutor began detailing the case. "Your Honor, Michael Carter was identified as an accomplice in an armed robbery at a convenience store on the night of November 12th. Witnesses claim he was near the scene at the time of the crime, and surveillance footage shows a vehicle registered in his name being used as the getaway car." Rebecca listened intently, jotting down quick notes in her pad. The evidence seemed solid, but something didn't add up. The prosecution portrayed Michael as a willing accomplice, yet the personal details in the dossier painted a picture of a hardworking family man with no criminal history. The contrast caught her attention. "Defense, would you like to make your opening statement?" Rebecca asked, her tone as direct as always. Michael's attorney, a young and visibly inexperienced public defender, stood hesitantly. He began speaking about Michael's character, describing him as a hardworking man and devoted father who did everything he could to support his children. He emphasized that Michael had no criminal record and was always known for his honesty. Michael Carter has been unjustly accused based on circumstances that do not reflect his character or the conduct he has displayed throughout his life. He is not a criminal but a man caught in a situation that demands deeper investigation, the attorney declared, with a determination that wasn't quite matched by confidence. Rebecca kept her expression neutral, but inside, something stirred. The more she observed Michael, the more she felt there was something beyond what was written in the case files. Her initial unease now seemed to grow, and despite years of courtroom experience, she couldn't shake the feeling that this man was connected to something far greater or far deeper. As the first pieces of evidence were presented, Rebecca tried to focus on the facts. The prosecution showed surveillance footage of a car resembling Michael's being used as a getaway vehicle. Witnesses claimed to have seen him near the crime scene. Even so, something about the story didn't feel solid. There were no clear motives for Michael, a man with a spotless record, to get involved in such a risky crime. When it was Michael's turn to testify, Rebecca watched him closely. He stood up, adjusted the microphone in front of him, and looked directly at her before speaking. "I am innocent," he said, his voice firm but not aggressive. "I've worked as a mechanic for 12 years. I have 2 young children who depend on me, and I would never risk their safety. On the night of the crime, I was at home fixing a part for a client. My car had been stolen weeks before, and I reported it to the police, but it seems no one believed me." Michael's words sounded genuine. Rebecca detected no hesitation in his voice, and the pain in his eyes seemed real. At the same time, something else caught her attention. There was a cadence in his speech, a way of expressing himself that felt familiar. A vague memory began to form in her mind, but she pushed it aside. This was not the time to let inexplicable feelings distract her. "You're saying your car was used in the crime without your knowledge?" Rebecca asked, her voice steady. "Yes, ma'am," Michael replied, looking directly at her. "I have nothing to hide. All I want is to go back to my children." Rebecca felt a pang in her chest as she heard those words. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to maintain her composure. Still, the sense of familiarity grew, and she began to wonder where she knew this man from. The name, the look, the tone of voice, they all seemed to echo from a distant place in her memory. The session was adjourned to allow the defense more time to gather evidence, and Rebecca returned to her chambers. Sitting in her leather chair, she held Michael's case file in her hands, staring at his photo clipped to the top corner of the page. "Michael Carter," she murmured to herself, as a long-buried memory threatened to resurface. The connection was there, but Rebecca still couldn't fully grasp it. Deep down, however, she knew this case would change her life in ways she couldn't yet predict. Rebecca Taylor was known for her ability to maintain composure in any situation. But that day, something inside her felt on the verge of unraveling. Michael Carter's case had unsettled her from the beginning, and as she reviewed the files before the trial resumed, the defendant's name and image stirred memories she had long buried. Rebecca tried to convince herself it was a coincidence. Michael Carter was a common name, and the man on trial could be anyone. Yet there was something in his eyes, something that transported her back to her childhood in Ashland, to a time when the world was simpler and her dreams were still intact. By the time Michael was brought back into the courtroom for questioning, Rebecca's heart was racing in a way she couldn't explain. He took the witness stand, adjusted the microphone, and looked directly at her. The room was silent, but inside Rebecca's mind, a storm was brewing. She saw the same determined look she remembered, mixed with a pain that seemed to mirror her own melancholy. "Mr. Carter," she began, her voice firm as always, "do you understand that you are under oath and must tell the truth?" "Yes, Your Honor," Michael replied, his voice laden with sincerity. It was a voice Rebecca would recognize anywhere. The prosecutor started with basic questions, reaffirming the details of the charges. Michael answered calmly, but his demeanor revealed the exhaustion of someone carrying an unbearable burden. Rebecca watched every movement, every word, and with each passing second, The certainty grew within her. This man was the Michael. Finally, it was the defense attorney's turn. He asked Michael to explain what had happened on the night of the crime. "I was at home, Your Honor," he said, looking directly at Rebecca as he spoke. "My kids were asleep, and I was working on a car part a client had brought in the day before. The car in the footage, it was mine, but it was stolen weeks ago. I filed a police report, but I never got the vehicle back." Rebecca struggled to keep her expression neutral, but her mind was elsewhere. Every word Michael spoke seemed to echo in the emptiness she had felt since the day he disappeared from her life. The memories came flooding back. His smile, the sound of his laughter, the day they promised never to part. Suddenly, Rebecca found herself back in the fields of Ashland, sitting by the river with Michael at her side. It was summer, and the sun reflected on the water. He held her hand, talking about the plans they had for the future. They believed nothing could separate them, but life had other plans. "Your Honor," the prosecutor's voice interrupted her thoughts. Rebecca blinked, returning to the present. "Yes, proceed," she replied, trying to mask the tremor in her voice. When it was Rebecca's turn to question Michael, she knew she would need to tread carefully. Taking a deep breath, she adjusted the papers in front of her and focused on what she needed to ask. Her tone was firm, but inside, her heart was pounding in her chest. "Mr. Carter," she began, "you claim that you were home on the night of the crime and that your car was stolen. Do you have any concrete evidence to support your statement?" Michael shook his head slightly. "I have the police report, but there are no witnesses who can confirm where I was that night. It's just my word." Rebecca paused before continuing. "Are you aware that the evidence presented against you, while circumstantial, could be sufficient for a conviction?" "I am, Your Honor," he replied, his tone resigned. "But I'm telling the truth. I've never done anything illegal in my entire life." There was a moment of silence in the room. Rebecca felt the weight of his words, as well as the direct gaze he maintained on her. Then, as if he had realized something, his eyes narrowed slightly. A flicker of recognition crossed Michael's face, and his expression changed. "Rebecca," he murmured, barely audible. The entire courtroom was silent, but for Rebecca, it felt as though time had stopped. She held her breath, unable to look away from him. For a moment, it was as if they were two kids in Ashland again, bound by a history that time had failed to erase. She didn't respond, but her eyes betrayed the neutral facade she had worked so hard to maintain. Michael noticed, and his expression hardened. He seemed to be piecing together how the girl he had left behind was now standing before him, passing judgment on him. Rebecca felt a tightening in her chest. It was as though all the emotions she had suppressed over the years were surfacing all at once. The session was adjourned shortly after the interrogation, giving both sides time to review the new evidence that would be presented. When Rebecca returned to her chambers, she locked the door and allowed her emotions to overflow. She sank into her chair, running her hands over her face, trying to process what had just happened. Michael was alive. He was there, in front of her, after all these years. All the questions she had buried about what had happened to him came rushing back. Why had he disappeared? Why had he never come back for her? What had brought him to this point in his life? And perhaps most painfully, how was she supposed to handle this now? Rebecca knew she had to maintain her impartiality. The courtroom was no place to resolve the past, but the connection between them was impossible to ignore. Memories of her childhood blurred with the stark reality of the case she now had to judge. She stood and walked to the window of her chambers. Outside, the city bustled with its usual routine, oblivious to the storm raging inside her. Rebecca knew that from this moment on, nothing would ever be the same. She would have to find a way to balance the judge she had worked so hard to become with the woman who still bore the weight of a lost love. That day, Rebecca realized that the past, no matter how deeply buried, always finds a way to return. And this time, it had come back in the form of Michael Carter, the boy she had never been able to forget. Rebecca Taylor remained seated in her imposing leather chair in her office, staring at the stack of documents on her desk. The room, usually her sanctuary of control and concentration, felt stifling that evening. The warm yellow light reflected off the shelves packed with legal books, while the silence was broken only by the ticking of an old clock on the wall. Rebecca rested her elbows on the desk and massaged her temples. Her face, typically composed and confident, now bore signs of unease. Her fingers slid slowly over the old photo she had pulled from a drawer moments earlier, as if searching for answers in the image. Michael was there, frozen in time, wearing the same carefree smile she had seen so many times. But the man now sitting in the defendant's chair seemed like a distant version of that memory. What had happened to him over the years? How had he ended up in this situation? She couldn't stop the whirlwind of questions. Where had he been? Why had he never reached out? And most of all, how was she supposed to deal with the fact that he was here now, in her courtroom, depending on a decision she was expected to make with complete impartiality? She stood up from her chair, feeling the tension in her shoulders, and walked over to the large glass window that dominated one wall of her office. Outside, the city lights glittered like tiny points of hope in a sea of darkness. Rebecca crossed her arms, hugging herself instinctively. The glass reflected her image, but what she saw wasn't the respected judge who had built a brilliant career. She saw the girl who used to sit beside Michael, dreaming of a future together. The memories hit her like a wave. That summer in Ashland, the afternoons by the river, the promises exchanged under the trees. Michael had always said they were invincible together, that nothing could separate them. But life had proven otherwise. He disappeared, and Rebecca had clung to her ambition to fill the void he left behind. Now, his presence was reopening wounds she thought had long healed. Rebecca returned to her desk but couldn't bring herself to sit. She began pacing the office, running her fingers along the books on the shelves. Each movement seemed like an attempt to escape the weight she was feeling. But the memories were relentless. She stopped in front of a shelf where she kept a small collection of personal items, including a notebook she had used as a teenager. Rebecca picked it up, hesitating for a moment before opening it. The yellowed pages were filled with thoughts and dreams she had written when she still believed anything was possible. Her eyes landed on a particular page. It was a list of plans she and Michael had made together: travel the country, open a small bookstore, build a house near the river where they used to spend their time. Rebecca smiled wistfully at the amateur sketch of a house Michael had drawn in the corner of the page. It was something so simple, but at the time, it had felt like the grandest dream. "Why did you disappear?" she murmured, her voice hoarse. The question hung in the air, unanswered, echoing in the silence of the room. Rebecca closed the notebook and placed it back on the shelf. She felt frustrated with herself for letting emotions take over where they had no place. She was a judge. She had a job to do. But how could she ignore what Michael still meant to her? She sat down at her desk again, staring at the case file. Her hand hesitated before opening the document. She knew she had to evaluate the evidence impartially, yet every detail seemed to carry an emotional weight. Michael's clean criminal record, his claims about the stolen car, the account of his life as a single father, all of it seemed to scream his innocence, but she couldn't allow herself to be swayed by personal impressions. Rebecca rested her forehead on her hand, feeling the emotional exhaustion take over. What if he's guilty? That question haunted her more than she wanted to admit. If Michael were convicted, it would be based on concrete evidence and legal grounds. But deep down, she wondered if she would ever forgive herself for being responsible for destroying his life. The dilemma was crushing. She knew she could recuse herself from the case, but that would mean publicly admitting her connection to Michael. Not only could it damage her reputation, but it could also raise questions about her ability to remain fair in other cases. On the other hand, staying on the case meant constantly battling the feelings that threatened to overwhelm her. Rebecca stood again and walked over to a small table where she kept a teapot. Her hands trembled as she poured herself a cup of tea. She took a sip, trying to calm herself, but the warmth of the liquid did little to ease the cold she felt inside. She knew she had to make a decision, but every option seemed more difficult than the last. Finally, she returned to her desk and picked up a pen. She began writing on a blank sheet of paper, not a report but scattered thoughts, just as she had done as a teenager. The words flowed almost uncontrollably. I don't know what to do. I've spent my life building this career, and now it all feels fragile in his presence. Michael was everything to me, and I never managed to forget him. I should be able to separate the past from the present, but it feels impossible now. How can I judge someone who still has such a hold on me? She stopped writing and looked at the words on the page. It was the first time she admitted, even to herself, that she still felt something for Michael. This realization terrified her. Rebecca Taylor, the steadfast judge, was lost in a conflict no law or rule could resolve. Leaning back in her chair, Rebecca stared at the ceiling. The clock continued its rhythmic ticking, but for her, time felt frozen. There, in her office, alone with her memories and doubts, Rebecca realized the greatest trial she would face wasn't Michael's, it was her own. When Michael Carter's hearing resumed, the atmosphere in the courtroom was heavy with anticipation. For Rebecca Taylor, seated at the judge's bench, the weight felt much more personal. She knew this would be one of the most challenging days of her career. Michael would be questioned again, this time with a focus on his life story. The defense had argued that to better understand the circumstances of the case, it was essential to give the defendant a chance to speak. Rebecca had allowed the request on the basis of a fair trial, but she knew that hearing Michael recount his life would be like reopening an old wound. When Michael took the stand, Rebecca observed him closely. He looked more exhausted than the day before, but he still carried that resilient expression that was so characteristic of him. He adjusted the microphone and glanced briefly at her before beginning. Rebecca averted her eyes, forcing herself to maintain her professional demeanor. The defense attorney approached and started with a simple question. Michael, can you tell us a little about your life story? Michael took a deep breath, his shoulders tense as he gathered his thoughts. I grew up in Ashland, he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion. My parents were simple people. My dad was a mechanic and my mom worked as a seamstress. We didn't have much, but we were happy, until the accident. He paused, and the entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath with him. Rebecca felt a pang in her chest. She knew about the accident but had never known the details. Now they would be laid bare for everyone to hear. I was 12 when everything changed. We were driving to visit my grandparents in a neighboring town, but it rained heavily that day. The car skidded off the road. I survived, but my parents didn't. From that moment on, my life was never the same. The silence in the room was absolute. Michael continued, his voice growing hoarser. With no family to take me in, I was placed in an orphanage. At first, I thought it would be temporary, that a relative would show up, but that never happened. I spent years there, and they were the worst years of my life. The place was horrible. The people who were supposed to care for us were cruel. There was abuse, neglect, and we, the kids, were left to fend for ourselves. Rebecca felt a lump in her throat. His words brought back memories of when she was just a girl, wondering where Michael could be. She had never imagined he was enduring something so dark. She clasped her hands in her lap, trying to hide any sign of emotion. When I turned 18, they kicked me out, Michael continued. They said I was an adult now and had to fend for myself. With no money and no one to help me, I ended up on the streets. The words came out slowly, as though each one was a battle. Living on the streets, it's hard to explain to someone who's never been through it. You're not seen as a person. It's like you're invisible to the rest of the world. I did odd jobs whenever I could, but it was always temporary. I spent years like that, fighting to survive. Michael paused, taking a deep breath. The attorney gave him a moment before asking, "And how did you get out of that situation?" One day, I met a man who needed help at his auto repair shop, Michael replied, his voice gaining a bit more strength. He gave me a chance. He said he saw potential in me, that I had a knack for cars, just like my dad. That's how I started working as a mechanic. It wasn't easy, but I saved up enough money to rent a small room. After some time, I met my wife, Rachel. She was my light. Michael paused again, and Rebecca noticed the glimmer in his eyes as he spoke about Rachel. Rachel and I built a life together. We had 2 kids, and for a while, it seemed like things were finally getting better. But she got sick. It was an aggressive cancer. I did everything I could to take care of her, but I lost Rachel 2 years ago. He looked down, trying to keep his emotions in check. Rebecca felt a tightness in her chest. She had never met Rachel, but she could imagine what she had meant to Michael. Since then, I've been doing my best to take care of my kids. I work long hours at the shop, but I always put my family first. I've never been involved in anything illegal. So when I was accused of this robbery, it felt like my world was collapsing. I don't know why someone used my car in the crime, but I swear it wasn't me. All I want is to clear my name and go back to my children. Michael paused, and the silence that followed felt endless. The defense attorney thanked him, and the prosecution asked a few quick questions, trying to find contradictions, but Michael remained steadfast. He showed no signs of nervousness or hesitation, only exhaustion. As Michael stepped down from the witness stand, Rebecca felt a wave of emotions she could barely contain. He had been through so much, more than she could have ever imagined. The girl she once was, the one who had loved Michael with all the innocence of her youth, felt crushed by the harsh reality he had endured. The case continued, but Rebecca knew that, for her, this was far more than just a trial. It was a painful reconnection with the past, a confrontation with everything that had been lost, and with the responsibility now resting on her shoulders. Michael Carter was not just another defendant in her courtroom. He was the boy who had once promised to stand by her forever, and now, somehow, he was depending on her for a chance to move forward. Rebecca took a deep breath, looking again at the documents on her desk. The struggle between justice and emotion continued to torment her. But at that moment, she knew the next step would be decisive, for both her career and her heart. Rebecca Taylor's office was quieter than usual that night. But the silence did not bring peace. It was heavy, laden with tension. Scattered across her polished wooden desk were papers, photographs, and documents that, when pieced together, began to reveal a troubling truth. Rebecca had spent the last 48 hours immersed in a personal investigation. Something about Michael Carter's case didn't add up. From the beginning, there were details that seemed out of place. The way the evidence had surfaced, so convincing yet shallow, had set off alarm bells in her mind. Now, the pieces of the puzzle were coming together, forming a much darker picture than she could have anticipated. It started with a police report she found in Michael's case file. He had reported his car stolen weeks before the crime, but the complaint seemed to have been ignored by the local police. Curious, Rebecca asked one of her assistants to look into the case's status. What they discovered left her alarmed. The report had never been officially entered into the system. Moreover, the statements from witnesses claiming to have seen Michael near the crime scene were inconsistent. One witness had changed their story multiple times, yet this inconsistency had gone unmentioned by the prosecution. Rebecca knew she had to dig deeper, and that's exactly what she did. As she reviewed the security footage obtained by the defense, she noticed something peculiar. The car allegedly belonging to Michael was captured on another camera just moments before the crime, in a completely different location. It was impossible for the car to have been in 2 places at once. This meant someone had used Michael's car to frame him. But who? And what? The answer came in the form of a name that repeatedly appeared in documents related to the case. Richard Harlow, an influential businessman with political connections and a pristine reputation, or so it seemed on the surface. Rebecca discovered that the convenience store where the robbery had occurred was owned by a subsidiary of Harlow's company. Even stranger, just days before the crime, the store's insurance policy had been increased significantly. A quick investigation revealed that Harlow was facing financial trouble in one of his ventures, and there were whispers that he employed questionable methods to maintain his wealth. Rebecca began to suspect that the robbery had been orchestrated as part of an insurance fraud scheme. Michael, with his vulnerable position, had been the perfect scapegoat. She started piecing together the connections. Harlow had enough influence to manipulate the local police, ensuring that Michael's stolen car report was ignored. He could have also bought off the witnesses or coerced them into tailoring their statements to place Michael at the crime scene. It was a clever scheme, but Rebecca knew that if she could gather solid evidence, the whole thing would collapse. As her investigation deepened, Rebecca began to notice she was drawing unwanted attention. One afternoon, returning to her office after a lunch break, she found an unmarked envelope on her desk. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a direct message. "Judge Taylor, drop the case or face the consequences." The warning was clear, but Rebecca was undeterred. She locked the note in a drawer and continued her work. However, as she drew closer to the truth, the threats became more explicit. She began noticing suspicious cars parked near her home and received anonymous calls at odd hours. In one of them, a cold male voice said only, "You don't know who you're dealing with?" Despite the growing fear, Rebecca refused to back down. This was no longer just about justice for Michael. It had become a matter of integrity. She knew that allowing an innocent man to be convicted to protect someone like Harlow would render her entire career meaningless. Rebecca realized she needed concrete evidence to take on Harlow and protect Michael. She decided to act discreetly, enlisting the help of an independent investigator she hired herself. The woman, a former police officer named Claire Dawson, was known for her skill in uncovering hidden truths. Claire discovered that one of Harlow's employees, a man named Thomas Reed, had made suspicious financial transactions in the days leading up to the crime. He withdrew a large sum of money and disappeared shortly after. Rebecca deduced that Thomas could be the key to unraveling the scheme, but finding him would be a challenge. Claire managed to track a lead. Thomas had been seen in a nearby town, staying at a cheap motel. With this information, Rebecca instructed Claire to gather as much evidence as possible before involving the authorities. If Thomas agreed to cooperate, his testimony could be the linchpin needed to bring down Harlow. As she waited for updates, Rebecca felt the weight of the threats mounting. She knew her life was at risk but couldn't retreat. Sitting in her office, poring over the documents again, she felt a mix of fear and resolve. Her thoughts constantly returned to Michael. He didn't deserve to be in this situation, and Rebecca knew that if she didn't act quickly, the trial could take an irreversible turn. That night, alone in her office, Rebecca made a silent promise. No matter the cost, she would fight for the truth. For the first time, she realized this fight wasn't just for justice. It was also for something she still felt deeply for Michael, a feeling that had never truly faded over the years. The courtroom was packed that morning. Michael Carter's case had gained national attention in recent days, and the room was filled with journalists, lawyers, and onlookers eager to witness the outcome. But no one was more aware of the gravity of the moment than Rebecca Taylor. Rebecca had spent sleepless nights reviewing every detail of the case, preparing for what lay ahead. The threats she had received were still fresh in her mind, but they couldn't deter her from her mission. She knew that exposing the truth about Michael and revealing Richard Harlow's involvement would be risky, but her conscience wouldn't allow her to make any other choice. Donning her robe, Rebecca adjusted the collar and looked at herself in the mirror before entering the courtroom. Her expression was resolute, but her eyes carried the intensity of someone prepared to face resistance. "This is it," she murmured to herself before opening the door and walking toward the bench. As Rebecca entered the room, the murmurs ceased. The authority of her presence was undeniable. Michael Carter sat at the defendant's table, his hands nervously clasped together, but he still carried that glimmer of hope Rebecca had come to recognize. He trusted her, and that only strengthened her resolve. "Let's begin," Rebecca said, her firm voice echoing through the room. She glanced at the defense and prosecution attorneys, who looked equally tense. The prosecution started by presenting their evidence, reiterating the arguments they had maintained from the start. Michael's car was used in the robbery, witnesses placed him at the scene, and his claim of innocence was inconsistent with the facts. The prosecutor appeared confident, as if convinced the case was already won. But Rebecca knew what was coming next. "Defense," she said after the prosecution concluded their presentation. "It's your turn to present your case." Michael's attorney stood up, but before he could speak, Rebecca interjected. "Before hearing from the defense, this court needs to consider new, relevant information that has come to light." The statement caused a ripple of murmurs across the courtroom. Journalists began furiously jotting down notes, and Michael's eyes widened slightly, confused but attentive. Rebecca took a deep breath and began laying out the facts. "During my review of this case," she said, "I discovered significant inconsistencies in the evidence presented against the defendant, Michael Carter. Specifically, the police report regarding the theft of his vehicle was never properly filed, despite being made prior to the crime. Furthermore, surveillance footage placing the car at the scene of the crime also shows the same vehicle in a different location minutes before the robbery. This is impossible." She paused, allowing her words to sink in. The prosecutor appeared rattled, and murmurs began to ripple through the courtroom. "But that's not all," Rebecca continued, her eyes now locked on the prosecutor. "During an independent investigation, I uncovered that the true perpetrator behind this crime has a direct connection to the site of the incident, businessman Richard Harlow." The name dropped like a bombshell in the courtroom. Journalists whispered furiously, cameras shifted to capture every reaction, and the audience seemed stunned. The prosecutor, visibly startled, stood to object. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. There's no evidence to support such an accusation." Rebecca raised her hand, silencing him. "The evidence will be presented now," she said, retrieving a folder from beneath her bench. "These documents show that Richard Harlow significantly increased the insurance coverage on the convenience store just days before the robbery. Additionally, one of his employees, Thomas Reed, recently confessed to being hired to stage the crime and frame Michael Carter." She gestured to a court officer, who handed the documents to both the prosecutor and the defense. This evidence was obtained through an investigation conducted with the help of a former police officer. It clearly establishes that the robbery was an insurance fraud scheme orchestrated by Harlow to cover his financial difficulties. The courtroom erupted into murmurs. Michael looked both confused and relieved. Rebecca maintained her steady gaze, watching as the prosecutor skimmed through the documents, his disbelief evident. It was clear he knew the case was lost. "In light of these revelations," Rebecca continued, her voice firm and commanding, "there is insufficient basis to uphold the charges against Michael Carter. This court hereby declares the defendant not guilty on all counts." For a brief moment, the courtroom was utterly silent, followed by an explosion of reactions. The audience appeared divided between shock and relief. Michael, sitting at the defendant's table, buried his face in his hands, overcome with emotion. Rebecca, however, remained composed. But she wasn't finished. This court also orders that Richard Harlow be immediately summoned to provide explanations regarding allegations of fraud and evidence tampering. Court officers will be dispatched to ensure his detention. That same evening, Rebecca's decision made headlines across every major news outlet. Judge exposes fraud and clears wrongfully accused defendant. The headlines read, "Legal analysts praised her courage for standing up to such a powerful businessman, even under threat." For Rebecca, however, recognition was not the goal. Her true victory lay in seeing Michael walk out of the courtroom as a free man. He had been wronged, but now he had the chance to rebuild his life. As she packed up her documents at the end of the day, Rebecca felt a mix of relief and exhaustion. The threats could continue, and Richard Harlow was not someone who would accept defeat quietly. But for the first time in years, Rebecca felt she had done something truly meaningful, not just as a judge but as someone still carrying a piece of the past she could never forget. As she left her office, she caught sight of Michael in the distance, speaking with his attorney. He looked over at her, his eyes full of gratitude. Rebecca returned a subtle nod, knowing that while the courtroom drama had ended, their story was far from over. The night was quiet, but inside Rebecca Taylor's heart, a storm of emotions brewed. After the tumultuous trial that had exonerated Michael Carter and exposed Richard Harlow's scheme, Rebecca knew there was something even harder to face. It was no longer about the courtroom but about her and Michael, a past filled with love, promises, and wounds that had never fully healed. After ensuring all the documents related to the case were securely locked in her office, Rebecca decided to leave. She didn't want to go home. She needed air, a moment to sort through the emotions overwhelming her. But just as she was about to exit the courthouse, she heard a familiar voice call her name. "Rebecca." She turned slowly and saw Michael standing at the end of the corridor. He looked hesitant, as if he wasn't sure he should be there. He wore simple clothes, but his eyes, the eyes she would recognize anywhere, were full of emotion. "Michael," she began, but her voice faltered. They stood in silence for a moment, just looking at each other. It was as if time had stopped. Finally, Michael took a few steps toward her, his eyes shimmering with a mix of relief and sorrow. "I needed to talk to you," he said, his voice low but filled with urgency. "After everything, after all these years." Rebecca took a deep breath, struggling to maintain her composure. "I think we both need to talk." They decided to walk through the courthouse garden. The area was empty, lit only by scattered lampposts among the trees. The cool night air seemed to ease some of the tension, but the silence between them was still heavy. "I don't even know where to start," Michael said, finally breaking the silence. He stopped and turned to face her, his eyes fixed on hers. "When I saw you for the first time in court, it was like my entire past came rushing back in an instant. I didn't know what to say, what to do." Rebecca crossed her arms, looking at him. "And you think it was easy for me?" she asked, her voice firmer than she intended. "You disappeared, Michael. Without explanation, without a goodbye. I spent years wondering what happened." He lowered his head, as if her words were a blow. I know I owe you an explanation. And maybe you'll never forgive me, but I need you to know what happened." Rebecca waited, crossing her arms in a defensive posture, as Michael began to speak. "After you left for college, everything started falling apart for me," he began, his voice heavy with emotion. "You know how much I wanted to go with you, but I couldn't. My family needed me. My dad was sick, and my mom could barely pay the bills. And then came the accident." Rebecca already knew about the accident, but hearing Michael talk about it was different. He described the chaos that followed, how he lost his parents and ended up in the orphanage. Each word seemed heavier than the last. "I wanted to write to you, to tell you what was happening," he continued, looking at her with pain in his eyes. "But I didn't know how. I didn't want you to worry. And when things got worse in the orphanage, I just didn't have the strength for anything. Surviving was all I could manage." Rebecca felt a lump form in her throat. She couldn't imagine what he had endured, and the fact that she had never known made her feel guilty. "When I left the orphanage, I tried to find you," Michael said, his voice now steadier. "I went to your college town, but you had already moved. I didn't know where you were. And after that, life happened. Living on the streets consumed me. Survival was all I could focus on." Rebecca felt tears welling up but held them back. "You never tried again?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper. "I did," he said, taking a step closer to her. "But Rebecca, I was a nobody. I had nothing to offer. How could I show up in your life after everything that happened and tell you I still loved you when I could barely take care of myself?" Those words hit her like a blow. For years, she had thought Michael had forgotten her, that he had simply moved on. But now, hearing his story, she realized he had never stopped thinking about her. "And now?" Rebecca asked, crossing her arms again to hide the tremor in her hands. "Why tell me all this now?" Michael took another step toward her, and the intensity in his eyes was unmistakable. Because now I have a chance to clear my name, to start over. And because, after all these years, I finally got the chance to see you again. I couldn't let it slip away. Rebecca felt her breath catch for a moment. Everything she had suppressed for years seemed to come rushing to the surface. She looked at him, seeing not just the man who had endured so much but also the boy she had loved deeply. Michael, I thought about you too, she confessed, her voice trembling. For all these years, I tried to convince myself you were part of the past, but the truth is, I never managed to forget you. He reached out, hesitantly, and lightly touched her hand. I never wanted to leave you, Rebecca. Never. For a moment, they stood there, connected by a simple touch that carried so much meaning. Words were unnecessary. The pain of the past was still present, but something stronger lingered, the love that had never faded. Finally, Rebecca stepped back, taking a deep breath. I don't know what happens next, she said, looking at him with sincerity. But maybe this is our chance to find out. Michael smiled, a soft, hopeful smile. I'm not going anywhere this time. I promise. And for the first time in a long while, Rebecca felt like she could believe him. The past had left scars on both of them, but together, maybe they could build something new. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but that night, under the soft lights of the courthouse garden, Rebecca and Michael took the first step toward facing the future, together. The days following Michael Carter's trial were a mixture of relief and uncertainty for Rebecca Taylor. The revelation that he had been framed and his subsequent acquittal were not only a legal triumph but also a deeply personal one. However, what stood out most was the feeling that a new chapter was beginning, both for Michael and for herself. Their relationship, interrupted years ago, seemed to have been paused only to resume with greater intensity. Yet Rebecca knew it wouldn't be simple. Both carried scars, physical, emotional, and psychological, that they would have to confront together. Michael began rebuilding his life with the same resilience that had kept him going for years. He threw himself into his work at the auto repair shop, where he now received support from customers who were touched by his story. Meanwhile, Rebecca made a point to be present whenever she could. She visited him after work, helped with his children, and slowly rediscovered parts of Michael she thought had been lost. For Michael's children, Rebecca was a welcome surprise. They quickly grew attached to her, captivated by her kindness and patience. For Rebecca, the two boys became a new source of purpose. They were a reminder of how much Michael had endured and how strong he truly was. You've really earned their trust, Michael said one evening as Rebecca read the boys a bedtime story. He stood in the doorway, a soft smile on his face. They need someone like you in their lives. Rebecca closed the book and glanced at him, a shy smile tugging at her lips. I'm not that great with kids. I think they're the ones teaching me. Michael shrugged, but the look on his face said otherwise. To him, Rebecca was more than enough. She always had been. Despite the happy moments, there were days when the past threatened to cast its shadow over them. Michael still carried the traumas of the orphanage and his difficult years on the streets, while Rebecca wrestled with guilt for not knowing what he had gone through. These pains sometimes surfaced in small arguments, often over trivial things, but they revealed deeper insecurities. Why didn't you just tell me before? Rebecca asked one night, after an offhand comment from Michael brought back her lingering sense of abandonment. I tried, Rebecca, he replied, his voice weary but steady. Do you think I didn't want to? You were all I had. But how could I drag you into my life when all I had to offer was chaos? Rebecca sighed, rubbing her temples. I know you went through so much, but I can't help wondering how things might have been different. Michael stepped closer, gently holding her hands. I can't change what happened, he said, looking into her eyes. But I can promise I'll never disappear again. No matter what. These conversations were hard but necessary. Slowly, they began to open their wounds to each other, facing their traumas with the honesty only true love could provide. Michael and Rebecca's story began to spread throughout the community. His case, which had already garnered national attention, was now seen as a symbol of perseverance and justice. People were moved by how Rebecca, even under pressure and threats, had fought for the truth, and by how Michael, after enduring so much, was rebuilding his life. The small circle of people around them was transformed as well. Michael's children began speaking proudly about their father, who was now treated with the respect he had always deserved. Rebecca, once seen as a distant and unapproachable figure, became an inspiration to her colleagues and friends. Her courage and compassion were frequently mentioned by those who knew her. "You too are an example of what it means to overcome challenges," remarked Claire Dawson, the investigator who had helped Rebecca with the case. "It's rare to see a love story that withstands so much time and so many obstacles." Rebecca smiled but didn't respond. For her, what truly mattered was the present. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time in years, she felt she was exactly where she needed to be. One quiet evening, Michael took Rebecca to the river where they had spent so much time together as kids. He had made sure the moment was just for them, free from distractions. The sound of the flowing water and the starry sky created an atmosphere that seemed pulled straight from their shared memories. "Do you remember when we used to talk about building a house by the river?" he asked, smiling as he skipped a small stone across the water. "Of course, I remember," Rebecca replied with a soft laugh. "You drew a terrible house in my notebook. I still have that drawing, you know." Michael chuckled, but his expression soon grew serious. He turned to her, taking her hands in his. "Rebecca, you were my hope when I was young. When I lost you, I thought I'd never have a second chance to feel something like that again. But now you're here, and I don't want to let this slip away again." Rebecca felt her eyes fill with tears. "I don't want to lose you again either," she said, her voice trembling. "I spent so much time pretending I was okay without you, but I never was." They moved closer, and for the first time in years, everything seemed to align. The love that had never faded was there, alive and strong, as if time and hardship had only made it stronger. Rebecca and Michael continued rebuilding their lives together, facing each challenge with the strength of those who know that true love can overcome anything. They weren't perfect, but their imperfections were part of what made them real. Their story, marked by pain and resilience, became a symbol of hope, showing that even in the most difficult circumstances, happiness is still possible. And above all, they proved that true love, though tested by time and adversity, never truly disappears. It simply waits for the right moment to bloom again. Michael's children adored Rebecca, and she, in turn, found in them the joy that had been missing from her solitary life. They began planning to move into a larger house, something that would represent their new beginning. Rebecca, ever practical, took care of the details, while Michael, excited, worked to ensure everything would be perfect for the boys. But life, as always, had one more surprise in store. One day, while reviewing old documents stored in boxes from the orphanage where Michael had grown up, Rebecca stumbled upon something that made her stop. It was a letter addressed to Michael that had never been delivered. The envelope looked formal, bearing the logo of a law office. Curious, she opened it. The contents were unbelievable. The letter revealed that Michael was the sole heir to a vast fortune left by a distant relative, a great-uncle he had never met. This man, an eccentric businessman, had searched for Michael for years but was unable to locate him due to the negligence of the system that had placed him in the orphanage. Rebecca was in shock. The letter, dated more than a decade ago, indicated that the inheritance had been waiting for Michael all this time, though he had never known it existed. Now, with the details provided in the letter, it was only a matter of time before he could claim what was rightfully his. That evening, Rebecca showed the letter to Michael. He was stunned, holding the paper as if it were something unreal. This can't be true," he murmured, looking at Rebecca. "I never knew of any relatives, let alone someone wealthy." "It's true, Michael," Rebecca said with a gentle smile. This is yours. Finally, life is giving you something back for everything you've been through. Michael remained silent for a long time, absorbing the revelation. He had always lived believing he had to fight for every penny, every opportunity. Now, fate was handing him something he never expected. A chance to truly start over, without the constant weight of financial struggles. It's not about the money, he said finally. It's about what it means. Maybe, after everything, I have a chance to give my kids a better life, and you too. Rebecca placed her hand over his, her eyes filled with warmth. You've already given us the most important thing, Michael. This is just the cherry on top. The news of Michael's inheritance spread quickly, shocking everyone who knew his story. He, however, remained humble, deciding to use part of the fortune to help other children in situations like the one he had faced in the orphanage. Together, he and Rebecca created a foundation dedicated to providing education and emotional support to vulnerable youth, ensuring no one else would have to endure what he had. Over time, their lives found a sense of stability. They moved into a beautiful house in the countryside near a river, fulfilling the childhood dream they had once shared. Michael's children grew up happy, surrounded by love and opportunities. For Michael and Rebecca, this new chapter was more than just redemption. It was proof that even in the hardest stories, fate can surprise you, and sometimes it even offers happy endings. Thank you for watching until the end. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to leave a like, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any content. There are more amazing stories waiting for you. Click here and keep watching.